Imagine walking into a courtroom, right? Like knowing full well that you are the one on trial.
Right, which is universally terrifying.
Exactly. But instead of sweating nervously or whispering with your lawyer, you just start shouting at the judge to hurry up and start the proceedings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You are literally begging for the verdict. Which, to a modern mind, sounds completely irrational. I mean, we are conditioned to fear the gavel.
We definitely are.
But thousands of years ago, the authors of some of the most famous ancient texts in the world did exactly that. And to understand why, we kind of have to completely dismantle how we read sacred literature.
It really requires a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we tend to approach these ancient sacred texts with a tremendous amount of historical baggage.
Oh, for sure.
We treat them like clinical user manuals for the universe. We're extracting data, categorizing rules, searching for these indisputable doctrines. We read them with this rigid, almost mathematical expectation.
Which is pretty much the fastest way to misunderstand them. And that actually brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
Right.
So we're looking at a collection of excerpts from the 1958 book Reflections on the Songs, written by the famous C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
And we're going to explore how one of the most analytical minds of the 20th century tackled this incredibly intimidating text, basically stripping away all that heavy theological dread and looking at it as pure, raw, and honestly startling poetry.
It is such an incredibly revealing source text. And yeah, largely because of who Lewis was, frankly. I mean, most people know him as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia.
Right, The Wardrobe and the Lion.
Exactly. But his academic resume is just staggering. He was an Oxford scholar who gained a triple first,
Which is crazy hard to do.
a ridiculously rare academic achievement. He was a fellow and tutor at Magdalen College for nearly 30 years, and later he became the professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. I mean, the guy was an absolute intellectual heavyweight.
But wait, if he's a professor of English and Renaissance literature, why are we looking to him to analyze ancient Hebrew theology? Like, wouldn't we want an actual theologian or a biblical historian to guide us through the Psalms?
Well, that is the exact question Lewis anticipates, and his answer is actually what makes this book so accessible.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's a crucial piece of context about his life that informs his entire approach to this. He was not born a comfortable traditional believer. For a huge portion of his life, he was a staunch atheist.
Right.
And when he finally converted to Christianity in 1929, he described himself as, and this is a quote, perhaps the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England.
Reluctant. Like, he really didn't want to be convinced.
He fought it every single step of the way. But that background gave him this unique empathy for apathy and skepticism. He really understood the active unwillingness to accept religion.
That makes a lot of sense.
So when he approaches the Psalms, he refuses to do so with any sort of preachy condescension. Instead, he introduces himself to the reader using this analogy of the two schoolboys.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the two schoolboys concept really struck me when I was reading the source material.
It's brilliant.
It really is. Lewis essentially argues that when you are a student, struggling with a difficult subject, going to the absolute top expert, the master, is often a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Because the master has internalized the basics so deeply that they can't even conceive of what is actually troubling the beginner. They end up over-explaining things you already know, adding useless historical trivia, and completely missing the root of your confusion.
What's fascinating here is that we see this in academia all the time. It's the curse of knowledge.
Yes.
The expert is viewing the subject from such an elevated altitude that they just lose sight of the ground-level obstacles. So Lewis suggests that a fellow pupil, a schoolboy, who just recently managed to solve that exact same math problem is infinitely more helpful.
Because they remember the pain.
Exactly. They remember the specific frustration. They know the exact hurdle because they literally just tripped over it themselves.
So Lewis is basically positioning himself as the fellow schoolboy.
He's incredibly explicit about his limitations. Right in the introduction, he states outright that this is not a work of scholarship. He admits, he's no Hebraist, no higher critic, no ancient historian, no archaeologist.
He's just a guy.
Right. He's writing for the unlearned about things in which he is unlearned himself. He frames the entire book as simply comparing notes with a fellow amateur.
I find that so liberating for anyone trying to learn a complex subject. Like, if you have ever felt completely overwhelmed by jargon when trying to pick up a new discipline, Lewis is giving you permission to just be a learner. You don't need a PhD to engage with something profound.
Absolutely.
And because he approaches the text as an amateur reader rather than this rigid theologian, he points out an obvious fact about the Psalms that experts seem to just routinely ignore.
Right, the fact that they are fundamentally poems.
Which changes all the rules of engagement.
It totally dictates the entire framework of comprehension. I mean, Lewis's core argument is that the Psalms are lyrics intended to be sung. They're not doctrinal treatises or legal codes.
Yeah.
He argues that you must read French as French and English as English. If you try to read a poem without allowing for hyperboles and dramatic emotional swings and, associative connections, you will completely miss what is in them and think you see what is not.
Let me test a modern analogy on you just to see if I'm grasping the severity of this mistake.
Sure, go for it.
So Lewis calls out these older preachers who tried to extract rigid, literal meanings from every single poetic line, resulting in ridiculous illusions he calls mare's nests. It sounds to me like analyzing a rhyming pop song and assuming every rhymed couplet represents a literal legal contract.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like if a singer says, "My heart is a stereo," you don't call a cardiologist to ask why the patient has a volume knob in their chest. You instinctively understand it's a metaphor. But with sacred texts, people seem to just lose that basic literary common sense.
The pop song analogy holds up perfectly because it highlights how genre dictates our literalness. When we revere a text too much, we paradoxically strip it of its art.
We make it boring.
Exactly. And to restore that artistic lens, Lewis breaks down the chief formal characteristic of the Psalms. It's a structural technique scholars call parallelism.
Which is basically saying the same thing twice in different words.
Right. It's the practice of echoing a thought for emotional resonance. Lewis highlights this classic example from Psalm 2, verse 4. It goes, "He that dwelleth in heaven shall laugh them to scorn, the Lord shall have them in derision."
Okay.
Now, the second half of that sentence, "the Lord shall have them in derision," doesn't add a new, legally distinct fact.
It's just a different coat of paint on the same feeling. Laugh them to scorn and have them in derision are hitting the exact same emotional note.
They're reinforcing the impact. And Lewis broadens the scope here to argue that this is actually a pure distillation of what all art involves. Yeah. He cites a definition of the principle of art as the same in the other.
I have to admit, I struggled a bit with that phrase in the reading. The same in the other sounds like a riddle.
It does, but it becomes clearer when you ground it in physical movement. Think of a traditional country dance.
Okay.
You take 3 steps to the right, and then you take 3 steps to the left. The movement itself, the 3 steps, is the same, but the direction right versus left is the other. The art is found in the pattern of repetition with variation.
Oh, that totally clicks for me now. And Lewis points out that in English poetry, we do this with rhyme. He quotes, "Christopher Marlowe cut is the branch that might have grown full straight, and burned is Apollo's laurel bough." But there is a massive logistical problem with English rhyme when you try to export it, isn't there?
Yeah, translation completely destroys it. If you translate a rhyming French poem into English, you're faced with this terrible choice. You either lose the rhyme completely to preserve the literal meaning, or you butcher the literal meaning to force a new English rhyme.
Because the structure is tied to the phonetic sounds of the original language.
Precisely.
Which makes Hebrew parallelism kind of a linguistic superpower. Because it's a repetition of thought rather than a repetition of sound, it actually survives translation. You can translate laugh them to scorn and have them in derision into Greek, Latin, German, or English, and the poetic structure remains entirely intact.
It miraculously survives the journey across cultures. It's really amazing. But Lewis doesn't just view this as a convenient literary trick. He elevates it.
How so?
Well, he argues that this translatable poetry is a divine choice that reveals something intimate about how the infinite communicates with the finite.
Okay, here's where I need you to connect the dots for me. Lewis calls this poetry a little incarnation. And I know incarnation generally refers to the divine taking on a physical human body. How does poetry act as an incarnation?
Think about the sheer difficulty of expressing a boundless divine imagination using the incredibly limited tool of human vocabulary.
It's like pouring the ocean into a teacup.
Exactly. Human language is small, but divine concepts are vast. Lewis suggests that just as the divine supposedly submitted to the constraints of a physical human body, the great imagination submitted to the constraints of human speech.
Wow.
Poetry, with its metaphors and structural patterns, is the only way to give a physical, audible body to invisible, infinite truths. The poetry is the body. It is a little incarnation.
That honestly reframes the entire text for me. And it leads to this fascinating historical observation Lewis makes about Jesus. Like, if poetry is the language of the divine, it makes total sense that Jesus was soaked in this tradition. He used parallelism constantly in his own teachings, like the phrase, "With what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged."
From the famous sequence, "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you."
Yes.
The core advice is given in the first phrase, and then immediately echoed twice with different imagery. It's textbook Hebrew parallelism.
But Jesus didn't just invent this speaking style in a vacuum. Humanly speaking, he would have absorbed it from his environment, specifically from his mother, Mary.
Yeah, the familial connection Lewis draws here forces us to look at the historical figures without the soft-focused lens of centuries of religious art.
It is my favorite historical insight in this whole deep dive. Lewis analyzes the Magnificat, Mary's famous Song of Praise, and notes that it shares this exact structural parallelism. But more importantly, it has a distinct tone.
Very distinct.
Lewis describes it as having a fierceness and an astringency. He even compares Mary to the ancient warrior judge Deborah.
Astringency is the perfect word there. I mean, it implies a sharpness, something that bites back.
Yeah.
It is definitely not a gentle lullaby.
Not at all. Lewis basically argues that the soft, gentle, painted Madonnas we see in Renaissance art and those mild hymn writers of the Victorian era do a massive disservice to the actual historical woman.
They sanitize her.
Completely. He even suggests, with a bit of a smile, that Jesus and Mary likely spoke in what the locals in Jerusalem would have considered a rough North Country dialect. It completely grounds them. It takes these untouchable gilded figures and places them in actual dirt, speaking a sharp, culturally distinct poetry.
And Lewis's willingness to embrace the rough, unsanitized reality of that poetry directly influences how he structures his entire book.
Yeah.
He doesn't want the sanitized version of the Psalms either. So he adopts a strategy he calls the sound principle of nursery gastronomy.
I love that phrase. It is so delightfully mid-century British. Nursery gastronomy.
It really is.
For anyone who didn't grow up in a 1920s boarding school, Lewis is talking about the childhood strategy of polishing off the nasty things on your dinner plate first and leaving the tasty items for the end. You know, you eat your bitter vegetables so you can enjoy your dessert in peace.
It's a brilliantly pragmatic way to approach difficult reading material. Rather than easing the reader in with the comforting, universally loved passages, Lewis skips the historical Psalms entirely and dives headfirst into those repellent, controversial topics the text has to offer.
Before we get to the most controversial topic, there is a fun methodological detail that highlights how committed Lewis is to the art of the songs. He deliberately uses the older Coverdale translation from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer for all his quotes.
Yes, which is an interesting choice.
Right. He admits openly that modern scholars have far more accurate Hebrew translations, but he chooses Coverdale anyway because the beauty of the phrasing is unmatched. He prioritizes the poetic resonance over clinical accuracy because, as we established, clinical accuracy kills the poem.
It's a bold choice, and it really ties into who Lewis is actually arguing with throughout this book, because he clarifies early on that he's not writing an apologetic work. He isn't trying to convince atheists that Christianity is true.
Right, so if he's not arguing with atheists, and he's not preaching to the hardcore believers, who is left to be offended by this book?
The demographic he calls semi-believers of all complexions. He describes them as enlightened, progressive old gentlemen whom no modesty can disarm. These are the academics and cultural critics who want the aesthetic and moral weight of religion, but get incredibly uncomfortable when you take the raw, unsanitized ancient texts seriously.
They want the gentle Madonna, not the astringent North Country poet.
Exactly. And by taking the unsanitized text seriously, Lewis serves up the first bitter vegetable of his nursery gastronomy. Chapter 2 of his book tackles the concept of judgment.
Which brings us back to that jarring courtroom scenario we started with. Judgment is a heavy, intimidating word.
It carries centuries of terrifying baggage. Lewis points out that if there is any thought at which a traditional Christian trembles, it is the thought of God's judgment. We have entire eras of art dedicated to the day of wrath.
Oh yeah, those intense paintings.
Medieval paintings of souls being cast into the abyss, scales weighing human hearts. It is framed as an event of ultimate terror.
And Lewis argues that this anxiety isn't just an invention of medieval painters, it goes back to the teachings of Jesus himself. He points to the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is deeply unsettling if you actually sit with it.
It's a profound source of religious anxiety because of the criteria for condemnation. In that parable, people are condemned entirely for sins of omission.
That is the terrifying part. They aren't judged for murder or theft or the act of evil they committed. They are judged for the good things they didn't do.
Right.
The hungry person they walked past, the sick person they didn't visit, things they perhaps never even realized were obligations.
It is a standard that leaves absolutely no conscience untouched. If judgment is based on what you fail to notice, then everyone is inevitably guilty. That is why modern believers dread the audit of their lives.
But here is the massive paradox that Lewis uncovers when he reads the Psalms. These ancient poems, written centuries before that parable, don't fear judgment at all. They view it in a completely alien light. They talk about it as an occasion for universal rejoicing.
They are actively demanding it.
Yes. Lewis quotes them begging the sky for it to happen. "Oh, let the nations rejoice and be glad, for thou shalt judge the folk righteously." And, "Judge me, O Lord my God, according to thy righteousness." They are yelling, "Bring on the judgment." Why is there such a massive disconnect between the ancient psalmist and the modern reader?
Because of the socioeconomic reality of the authors, Lewis brilliantly clarifies the difference by asking us to consider what kind of court we're imagining. When a modern, relatively comfortable person thinks of judgment, they imagine a criminal court.
Where you are the defendant in the dock, hoping for an acquittal or a lenient sentence?
But the ancient psalmists were not imagining a criminal court. They were imagining a civil court. And in a civil court, they're not the defendant, they're the plaintiff.
Oh, wow. That completely changes the framing. I hadn't thought of it that way.
You have to remember the historical context of these writers. They were constantly being invaded, dragged into exile, and crushed by corrupt local magistrates.
Right.
They were the oppressed, the forgotten, the people who had their farms stolen by the rich and powerful. For them, a judge isn't someone who sends you to jail for a sin of omission. A judge is the only person who can force the corrupt system to give you your farm back.
It makes total sense when you put it like that. If you are comfortable and privileged, judgment is a threat to your status. It is an audit you might fail. But if you have been cheated by a corrupt system, judgment is the long-awaited arrival of fairness.
Exactly.
It's the incorruptible authority finally stepping in to right the wrongs of a deeply unfair world. In that context, of course you would celebrate the judge's arrival. You would beg for the trial to start.
It's a stunning reversal of expectations. And Lewis uses it to prove his overarching point. If you read these ancient poems with your own modern, rigid assumptions, you miss the profound, unsanitized humanity hidden inside them. You miss the plaintiff crying out for justice because you're too busy worrying about being the defendant.
Man, so what does this all mean for us? We have covered a lot of ground today. We started by dismantling the idea that you have to be an expert to engage with complex texts, learning to approach them as fellow schoolboys comparing notes.
We explored the universally translatable art of parallelism, the same in the other, which miraculously survives the journey across languages.
We saw how that translatable poetry acts as a little incarnation, bringing divine concepts into the sharp, astringent, everyday dialect of historical figures like Mary.
And we confronted the principle of nursery gastronomy, tackling the hardest concepts first, which revealed the shocking paradox of judgment, the difference between fearing the criminal docket and demanding civil justice.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We saw how the ancient psalmists' view of judgment was entirely dependent on their societal position as the oppressed. It forces a really uncomfortable reflection.
Yeah, think about this. If the idea of an ultimate objective standard of justice fills you with dread rather than hope, what does that say about your current position in the world? Are you dreading the judge because you are secretly aware you are holding on to something that doesn't belong to you?
Oof, that's a heavy one. As you go through your week, try to look for the poetry hidden in your own everyday language. Listen for the parallelism in how people repeat themselves when they're emotional. And remember, you don't have to treat ancient texts like a rigid user manual for the universe. Sometimes you just need to put down the manual and listen to the music. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.